When I married into my wife's powerful family, they called me a nobody, a mechanic who didn't belong in their world of money and marble floors. Her father laughed when I said I'd build something of my own. But power isn't always loud. Sometimes it's patient. Years later, I walked into his boardroom, not as his son-in-law, but as the man who owned everything he thought I couldn't. That day, I didn't want revenge. I wanted respect. And when he looked at me, for the first time, he finally saw what he'd been blinded to all along. I still remember the first night I met Emily's parents and the exact shade of disappointment on her father's face. It wasn't anger or rudeness. It was the polite kind of judgment that rich men wear like cologne. Richard Harlow was the kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make you feel small. He owned half of downtown Boston's interior design firms, had his name etched into marble lobbies, and when he shook my hand, I swear I could feel him measuring the price of my watch. His wife, Margaret, smiled too kindly, in that way people do when they're embarrassed for you. I was 26, an accountant from Worcester, wearing my only good suit and shoes that still smelled faintly of factory polish. Emily had told me to relax, that her parents just needed time. But when Richard asked me what my 5-year plan was, and I said to start my own firm someday, he chuckled, leaned back in his leather chair, and said, "That's cute. Just remember, some dreams come with a cost your bank account can't pay." I laughed politely. Emily squeezed my hand under the table. But something in me hardened that night. Not out of anger, but out of quiet resolve. I wanted to prove that men like Richard Harlow didn't decide what I could become. Emily and I married a year later, against her parents' wishes. They didn't come to the wedding. She walked down the aisle in a simple white dress, barefoot on a Cape Cod beach, the Atlantic wind tangling her hair. We didn't have much, just a one-bedroom apartment above a bakery and a dream that seemed too big for the ceiling we lived under. I worked long hours at a small accounting firm, saving every penny. And at night, I'd sketch ideas for financial software that could help small businesses. Emily believed in me like it was her religion. There were nights when I'd tell her, "Maybe your dad was right. Maybe this is all just a fantasy." And she'd roll over, lay her head on my chest, and whisper, "Then let's make the fantasy real." Those words kept me going. Through rejections, debt, and nights when dinner was instant noodles and a shared bottle of cheap wine. We built our life one brick at a time. Love first, hope second, and stubbornness somewhere in between. I didn't realize it then, but those early years, when it was just us against the world, were the foundation of everything that came later. 5 years passed and the world began to notice what I'd built. My small software startup, LedgerPoint, grew faster than anyone expected. What started as an app for local businesses expanded into a full financial platform, clean, intuitive, and built for companies tired of bloated corporate systems. Investors called, then banks, then media outlets. By the time I turned 32, my little dream had turned into a company worth tens of millions of dollars. But I wasn't chasing wealth, not really. Every time my phone buzzed with another investment offer, I thought of that smirk on Richard Harlow's face, that subtle amusement that said I'd never be in his league. It wasn't revenge I wanted, it was recognition, not just from him, but from the version of myself who once believed I wasn't enough. Emily and I had turned her passion for art and design into her own small studio. She never mentioned her father anymore. It was like the Harlows had been erased from our lives, until the night their name found its way back to me, printed in black ink across a headline, "Harlow Interiors Faces Financial Turmoil After Investor Walkouts." I read that headline 3 times before it sank in. Richard's company, the untouchable empire that had looked down on me, was crumbling. Years of overspending, bad partnerships, and a failed expansion into Europe had gutted their profits. The same investors who once toasted Richard at luxury galas were now running from him. I didn't celebrate. Instead, I sat quietly at my desk, staring at the news article as if it were an old photograph. Emily came in with 2 mugs of coffee and noticed the headline. For a moment, neither of us said anything. Then she sighed, softly. He won't ask for help. He'd rather drown than admit he's sinking. I looked at her, the same woman who'd walked away from her parents for love, and realized she wasn't angry. She was sad. He's still your father, I said gently. She nodded. And you're still the man he said would never make it. We both laughed quietly, but there was something else in that silence. A flicker of fate. A door opening that neither of us had asked for, but somehow knew we had to walk through. A week later, an embossed envelope arrived at our home. The handwriting was unmistakable. Sharp, practiced, elegant. Inside was a formal invitation. Mr. and Mrs. Harlow request the pleasure of your company for dinner at the Harlow Estate, Friday, 7 p.m. There was no apology, no explanation, just a signature that smelt faintly of arrogance. Emily looked at the card for a long time. You don't have to go, I told her. We're not those people anymore. She shook her head slowly. Maybe not, but sometimes you need to face the ghosts you left behind. When Friday came, I drove us through the long tree-lined roads that led to the Harlow mansion. It looked exactly as I remembered, pristine, cold, and towering over the city like it was allergic to humility. As the gate opened, I felt something strange. Not fear, not even anger, but a calm I'd never felt before. I wasn't the nervous kid meeting his girlfriend's father anymore. I was a man who'd built something from nothing. And tonight, I was walking into a room that didn't control me anymore. When we pulled up to the Harlow mansion, I felt the kind of silence that sits heavy in your chest. The place looked almost identical to how I remembered it. Manicured hedges, white stone columns, the front door large enough to make a man feel small just walking toward it. A valet opened the car door for us, and for a brief moment, I caught our reflection in the window. Emily looked radiant, confident, her black dress simple yet stunning, her posture calm but firm. She didn't need to say it, but I knew this was hard for her. Inside, the house smelled like it always had: old wood, expensive candles, and money. The dining room was already lit when we entered, a long table set for 8. Richard stood at the far end, glass of bourbon in hand, smiling a little too broadly. Emily, he said, voice rich with charm he'd reserved for guests, not family. You look grown up. His eyes slid to me. Jake. He didn't offer his hand this time, just a nod. Margaret appeared beside him, ever the diplomat. It's been too long, she said. You two look well. I smiled politely. We've been lucky. My voice didn't shake. That alone felt like victory. Dinner started like a play, everyone acting out the roles they'd written years ago. Richard talked about business, about how the economy was tough and how loyalty was hard to find these days. I listened quietly, cutting my steak with slow precision. Across the table sat Richard's business partner, Thomas Grant, and his wife. They looked uncomfortable, their smiles tight. Emily tried to steer the conversation toward art, travel, life, anything but numbers. But Richard always brought it back. Jape, what are you doing these days? He finally asked, his tone light but probing. I'm still in accounting, I met his eyes. Still in finance, I said. But I left firm work a while ago. I run my own company now. His brows lifted slightly. Ah, self-employed. That's, brave. He said it like a compliment, but dressed it in disbelief. I smiled. Something like that. The table fell quiet for a moment. You could almost hear the clink of tension between the silverware. I could tell he didn't know. That was fine. He'd find out soon enough. Dessert was served, some overly perfect creme brulee that cracked louder than the conversation. Then Richard leaned back and sighed, dramatically, like a man about to deliver bad news he thought would make him look noble. To be transparent, he said, it's been a difficult quarter for us. The press loves to exaggerate, of course, but we're exploring some acquisition options. His tone was rehearsed, calm, controlled. Margaret placed her hand on his arm, a silent cue to keep his dignity intact. Of course, Richard, Thomas said, clearing his throat. That's a strategic move, not a desperate one. Richard smiled faintly. Exactly. Then he turned to me, as if the thought had just occurred. Funny thing, Jake, your field must give you quite the view of the market. I suppose you've seen companies rise and fall. His eyes lingered on me, the way a cat watches a bird. I met his gaze without blinking. I have, I said evenly. Sometimes the fall is the best part. That's when you find out what the company was really made of, and who was just pretending to lead. The air shifted. Emily's fort paused mid-air. Richard's smile froze for half a second before he forced a laugh. Well, he said, you've learned your metaphors, I see. After dinner, he invited me to his study, the room I remembered too well. The walls were lined with shelves full of awards, framed deals, and photographs of handshakes that probably didn't age well. A decanter of whiskey sat between us. I'll get straight to it, he said, pouring 2 glasses. Harlow Interiors has hit a rough patch. Some bad investments, some unreliable partners. But I have an acquisition offer on the table, a generous one. He paused, then looked at me as if testing the water. The buyer's group is anonymous, but they're offering full debt coverage and long-term retention for management. It's practically charity. He chuckled. Imagine, someone actually believes in old Harlow. I took the glass, rolled the whiskey in my hand, and studied the room. The empire that once intimidated me now looked smaller. The trophies, the gold pens, the leather-bound deals, they were just trinkets of a man who thought success was permanent. I said finally, you should take the offer. It's rare to find someone willing to bet on you when the numbers don't. He nodded, clearly pleased to have his decision validated. You're right, he said, leaning back. Maybe there's hope for me yet. I smiled faintly. Oh, there's more than hope, Richard. There's history. And sometimes it circles back. When we left the mansion that night, the sky was heavy with rain. Emily was quiet as we walked to the car. You didn't tell him, she said, finally. I shook my head. Not yet. She looked at me, half curious, half nervous. Why? I smiled softly. Because sometimes the best way to teach a man humility is to let him walk straight into it. The rain began to fall as we drove away, soft at first, then steady, washing the dust off the roads, the kind that sticks to things that have been untouched for too long. Emily rested her head on the window, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked older tonight. I nodded. Failure ages people faster than time does. She sighed. Do you really want to do this? I glanced at her, then back at the road. No, I said quietly, but I think it's already been done. She didn't ask what I meant. She didn't need to. The acquisition papers had already been signed. The anonymous group Richard thought was saving him, that was us. Ledger Point Holdings had acquired Harlow Interiors 48 hours before dinner, and by Monday morning, he'd find out who really owned the empire he once used to measure my worth against. Monday morning came like a storm, hiding behind sunlight. I sat in my office, floor-to-ceiling glass windows overlooking Boston Harbor, sipping my coffee as my assistant laid out the agenda. My company, Ledger Point Holdings, had finalized the paperwork late Friday night. The acquisition of Harlow Interiors was officially complete, though the public announcement was scheduled for noon. I should have felt triumphant, but what I really felt was something quieter, something like closure, whispering its way through old wounds. Emily had left early for her studio. She said she didn't want to see the press conference. "He'll find out soon enough," she told me, "and when he does, I just hope you still sound like the man I married, not the one he used to be." Those words stayed with me as I tightened my tie and stared out at the skyline. Somewhere across the city, Richard was probably sitting in his office, sipping his bourbon, believing he'd just saved his legacy. He had no idea that the signature on his salvation belonged to the same man he once called a dreamer with a poor man's ambition. By 11, my phone began to buzz. First it was a journalist, then two analysts, then a message from Thomas Grant, Richard's longtime partner, asking for a private meeting. I told him to bring Richard with him. The boardroom was ready when they arrived. A long mahogany table, fresh contracts laid out, the company's new logo gleaming on the monitor. Harlow Interiors, a subsidiary of Ledger Point Holdings. When Richard walked in, he looked like a man trying to wear confidence as armor. "Morning," he said briskly. "I wasn't aware you'd be attending, Jake." I smiled. "It's my building. I figured I should show up." He gave a small chuckle. "Impressive offices. Emily must be proud." "She is," I said, meeting his eyes. "But she doesn't know we're meeting. I thought this one should stay between us." He looked puzzled, but sat down anyway. Thomas looked 10 years older than when I'd last seen him, probably from weeks of sleepless nights and desperate negotiations. "We're here to finalize the operational transition," Thomas said, fidgeting with his pen. "The buyers want to meet management before integration." Richard nodded. "Of course, I'm eager to know who I'll be working with." I leaned back, folded my hands, and said softly, "You already know him." The room went still. Richard frowned, clearly waiting for me to explain. I clicked the remote, and the company's acquisition document appeared on the screen. Digital ink glowing in crisp black and white. The buyer's name sat neatly at the bottom. Ledger Point Holdings, CEO, Jacob H. Miller. Richard didn't react at first. His eyes scanned the page once, twice, then froze. He blinked as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something more logical. "This is a joke," he said finally, his voice low. "A cruel one." "It's not," I said quietly. "You signed those documents yourself. The sale was sealed Friday night." Thomas looked between us, confused. "Richard, you didn't recognize the holding name?" Richard turned to him, color draining from his face. "Ledger Point? That's your company?" I nodded. "Yes, the same company you once said I didn't have the bank account to build." He stood up suddenly, the chair scraping against the floor. You planned this?" "No," I said. "You did. You built your empire on the idea that people like me would always stay beneath you. All I did was wait for gravity to finish its work." For a long moment, he didn't speak. He just stared at the screen, his hands trembling slightly, not from anger, but from disbelief. I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. "You think this is victory," he finally said, voice sharp. "You bought a dying company. You think owning Harlow Interiors makes you my equal?" I stood, slowly. "No," I said. "It makes you my reminder." I walked closer, lowering my voice. "When you told me years ago that dreams cost more than I could afford, you were half right. Dreams are expensive, but arrogance, that's bankrupting." His jaw tightened. "You have no idea what it takes to hold a legacy together." I smiled faintly. "You're right. I built mine from scratch, not from inheritance." Thomas tried to diffuse the tension, mumbling something about transition plans, but it was useless. Richard's pride had finally run out of oxygen. He grabbed his briefcase and moved towards the door, his voice barely steady. "You'll regret this. Not everything can be bought." I didn't stop him. "You're right again. Respect isn't bought. It's earned. You just never learned how." When he left, the room felt strangely lighter, like someone had opened a window in a house that hadn't breathed in years. Thomas stayed behind, shaking his head. "I didn't know," he said. "If I'd had—" I stopped him. "You didn't need to. This wasn't about revenge." He looked skeptically. Then what was it about? I thought for a moment and then smiled. Balance sheets aren't just for money, Thomas. Sometimes life has debts that numbers can't measure. He didn't respond. He just nodded and left, closing the door behind him. I stood alone for a while, staring at the city below, the place where I had once been invisible, now looking back from the top floor. For the first time, I didn't feel proud or angry. I just felt free. Emily called an hour later. "He knows, doesn't he?" she asked softly. "Yeah," I said. "He knows." There was a pause, then she whispered, "So, what happens now?" I looked out at the skyline where the Harlow building's name still glimmered faintly in the distance. "Now," I said quietly, "now we decide what to do with the pieces." 2 weeks passed after that boardroom showdown, and the world outside moved faster than my thoughts could catch up. Every business journal in Boston had the same headline: Anonymous investor acquires Harlow Interiors in surprise takeover. They didn't mention names, but people in the industry were connecting the dots. Emily's last name gave us away. I told her it didn't matter. The truth always surfaces eventually. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she spent most of her time at her studio, painting like she used to before her father's voice taught her to measure beauty in profits. Sometimes I'd watch her through the glass, sunlight sliding across her face as she painted in silence, unbothered, untouchable. One evening she looked up and said, "You did it, Jake. You really did." I smiled. "We did." But she shook her head, eyes soft. "You faced him, not me. You freed me from something I didn't even know was choking me." I didn't know what to say, so I just held her hand and whispered, "Then let's never let pride own us the way it owned him." 3 days later, I got an invitation, hand-delivered, thick ivory paper embossed with the Harlow family crest. It was from Richard's assistant. Art exhibition, The Harlow Legacy, a celebration of design and family. I almost laughed. The man was relentless. Even stripped of ownership, he wanted to pretend he still mattered. Emily hesitated when she saw the invite. "Do you want to go?" she asked quietly. I looked at her for a long time before answering. "Yeah, I think it's time to close the book." That Friday night, the gallery downtown buzzed with soft music and expensive perfume. Chandeliers sparkled like artificial stars. The walls were lined with Emily's old designs, her sketches from when she first started working under her father, when her talent was treated like a family accessory. Richard was at the center of it all, still in his navy suit, still surrounded by people who owed him too much to stop pretending. But when he saw us walk in, his voice faltered mid-conversation. The room seemed to pause, whispers rippling like quiet wind. Emily's hand tightened around mine. I squeezed back. "You ready?" I whispered. She nodded, though I could feel her trembling slightly. We approached him slowly. Richard's smile tried to stay in place but cracked around the edges. "Emily," he said, his tone rehearsed, "you look radiant." "Thank you, Dad," she replied, her voice calm but distant. He glanced at me next, expression unreadable. "Jake." I nodded. "Richard." The silence between us was heavier than all the glass and gold in that room. He cleared his throat. "I see the media's been kind to you. Congratulations on your little acquisition." I smiled faintly. "It's not little anymore. We've already rehired 200 former employees you laid off last year." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "You think charity fixes incompetence?" "No," I said, "but it fixes what arrogance broke." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Emily stepped forward, her voice clear and steady. "Dad, this isn't about business anymore. It never was. You wanted loyalty, not love. You trained everyone, even me, to fear disappointing you. Jake didn't destroy you. He just stopped being afraid of you." The gallery fell silent. The guests turned away, pretending not to listen. Richard's face turned pale. "You're my daughter," he whispered, voice shaking, "and I loved you enough to make you strong." Emily's eyes glistened. "No, you made me hard. Jake taught me the difference." He didn't respond. He just looked down at the floor. The same man who once filled every room like thunder, now shrinking beneath the quiet truth of his own reflection. After a long pause, he whispered, "What do you want from me?" Emily shook her head. "Nothing. That's the point. We're not here to take anything. We came to give it back. The fear, the weight, the need to prove ourselves." She placed her old Harlow ID badge on the nearest table. It landed with a soft metallic clink that sounded louder than any argument. "Keep your legacy," she said softly. "I have my own now." And with that, she turned away. I followed her toward the exit, the murmur of the crowd fading behind us. But just as we reached the door, I heard him call out, not in anger this time, but in something closer to surrender. "Jake." I turned. His eyes looked different, tired, human. "You were right," he said quietly. "I did underestimate you." I met his gaze, the edge of anger in me finally dissolving. "You didn't underestimate me, Richard. You underestimated love." Then I left him there, surrounded by the ghosts of everything he'd built and lost in the same breath. Outside, the city air was cool and sharp, carrying the sound of traffic and laughter from the nearby street. Emily exhaled deeply, like she'd been holding that breath for years. "It's over," she whispered. I nodded. "Yeah, it's over." She smiled faintly. "Feels strange, doesn't it? Peace." I laughed softly. Peace always feels strange when you've spent your life fighting for it. We walked in silence for a while before she stopped in front of a large gallery window displaying her new work, signed E.M. Miller, not Harlow, Miller. I looked at the name and felt something shift inside me, a quiet pride that had nothing to do with winning. "You changed your name," I said. "I didn't," she replied, smiling. "I just stopped borrowing his." For the first time in years, I saw her completely free, not as a daughter proving herself or a woman surviving a legacy, but as someone finally whole. I slipped my arm around her shoulders. I asked her, "What now?" She looked up at the night sky, the city lights reflecting in her eyes. "Now," she said softly, "we build something that belongs to no one but us." And that was it. That was the real victory. Not the deal, not the takeover, not the power shift. Just this quiet night, the air clean again after the storm. In the months that followed, Harlow Interiors began to thrive under new leadership. We turned it into a place where creativity meant more than profit margins, where people felt seen. Reporters called it the rebirth of compassion in corporate America. I never corrected them, because in a way they were right. But I knew the truth. It wasn't about rebirth. It was about release. Letting go of the people who once defined you and realizing they never owned you to begin with. Emily's paintings began selling nationally. She even did a charity exhibit dedicated to the underestimated. Richard eventually retired quietly to a coastal town in Maine. Sometimes he sends postcards, short, polite, always signed with just his name. No apologies, no explanations, but that's okay. Forgiveness doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it just looks like moving on. So that's the story. My story. I didn't marry into a dynasty. I dismantled one and built a family instead. People still ask me how it feels to win. I tell them the truth. Winning isn't taking someone else's crown. It's realizing you never needed one.